Genesis. Some of you have been here for the 2 years that we've been on the whole journey. And yeah, we really are on the downhill now, but we're even on the downhill of the Joseph cycle of the narrative. And in a sense, it's kind of reaching its climax, or has reached its climax. One of the things was fascinated yesterday thinking about this. From a human perspective, the world in which most of us live, the most exciting thing about the Joseph story ought to have been his rise to power and wealth and influence in Egypt. And here you have, Brad Moore should be here. He should make a movie about this for Hallmark. Poor little rural Canaanite boy, sold into slavery in Egypt, rises to influence, backstabbed, goes to prison, eventually makes it out, interprets the future for Egypt, is appointed second in command of the most powerful country of the world, and guides their fortunes to preserve the nation and to establish the Pharaoh and the dynasty for years to come. Those are the kinds of things that get attention in our world. And Genesis just has sort of mentioned that in passing. Because the real story of Genesis, at least from chapter 12 on, is a promise made by God to an old man. That though he had no children, he would become the father of many nations. All the nations of the earth would be blessed through him and would bless themselves by him. And that his descendants would be as countless as the stars in the heavens and the sand on the seashore, and that he would possess the land of Canaan. And the book has been about that, with very some themes. And so the Joseph narrative, with all this power and wealth and influence in Egypt, that only matters in Genesis because it's the means by which God is going to preserve and fulfill the promise. I think it was one of you a week or so ago used a phrase that's stuck in my mind a little while. We'll see how long it lasts. God was creating in Egypt a nursery where the offspring that were promised could begin to grow and develop. So, for that reason, after all the drama of, well, here comes the brothers into Egypt, here come the brothers into Egypt, and Joseph recognizes them, they don't recognize him. He sort of pushes them, probes them, tests to find out what kind of transformation has taken place in their lives across the years. And finally, in a moment that we were anticipating, discloses himself to them. But then the next point is, got to get Jacob down here. And that's essentially where we are now, the bringing of the father down into the promised land. So that the story can finish not with the power and prestige of Joseph, but with the moving on of the promise. So, would somebody read Genesis 46, 28 to 34 for us?
Israel sent Judah ahead to Joseph to lead the way before him into Goshen. When they came to the land of Goshen, Joseph made ready his chariot and went out to meet his father Israel in Goshen. He presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, I can die now, having seen for myself that you are still alive. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our ancestors, in order that you may settle in the land of Goshen, because all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians.
Okay. Interesting. Joseph has sent the wagons. If you remember last week, we talked about the importance of the wagons. They've sent the wagons. The Lord appeared to Jacob in a dream, a vision, and says, go on, go down to Egypt, going to fulfill the promise. And now they're on their way, and Judah is sent ahead to lead the way into Egypt. What's the significance of Judah being singled out for this role?
It's definitely foreshadowing the increased importance of the tribe of Judah. It shows character growth on his part and a lessening on Reuben's part.
Okay. Yep. And as later folks read this and hear it told, for at least the at least the first 1,500 years of it's being told and read, it'll be told and read in that context of either all the tribes and Judah having a prominent role, or Judah being the only tribe that's left after the northern kingdom falls in 722. So that sense of God had his hand on Judah even at this point. And this is, in a sense, prophetic of the leadership that person will play, not just in the nation, but in the unfolding and fulfilling of the promise. It's out of Judah that the dynasty that will be forever, the dynasty of David, is to come. Okay? The land of Goshen. One of the best known places we don't know where is.
Where is it?
It's in Indiana.
Oh, it is? You've been there, huh? You do run out of gas, have to get off the interstate somewhere. There is no Egyptian word that corresponds to the Hebrew word that's translated Goshen in our text. And the Greek word in the Septuagint that gives some similarity to the land to Goshen. So critical Bible scholars have made a big deal of that. We don't know where this is. It's interesting, the description here and in the larger context here suggests that it needs to be a place where there's pasturage for animals to graze. And for that reason, and because it's the closest, most folks have placed it somewhere in the East Delta, if you're going to call the northeast section of Egypt, as a part of the Delta. I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to find out. First of all, this map. There you go. Not too bad. Gives you a spot as if Goshen were a town as opposed to a region. Let's see if this one will work. This is off of Google Earth right now, and the same location. And you can see now this is pretty much major metropolitan area with some foliage and grass and whatnot around it. Zoom out, I think.
Would it have been during that time though, Roger? Would it have been a highly populated area?
Doesn't appear to have been.
Right. Which would make sense, wouldn't it? Because it's kind of like, well, then you can, if they abhor shepherds, then you can be over there and...
Yeah, yeah. To pick up on the abhorring of shepherds.
Right.
Why would Egyptians abhor shepherds?
The sheep or the livestock will eat all their grain.
Okay.
Come through.
In their minds, it's much more efficient to grow the grain and them eat it than to grow the grain, have the livestock eat it, and then eat the livestock. There's a step in there that they didn't think they needed. Someone mentioned there are byproducts that come with animals that are what? Stinky, okay, yes. Odiferous, to use a seminary word. Yeah. The Egyptians had the capacity because of what? To have grain.
The flooding of the Nile.
The Nile, the flooding of the Nile. And the Nile also provides transportation. It also provides bath potential. So Egyptians bathed on a very regular basis. Canaanites bathed, as some of my ancestors used to like to say, once a year, whether they needed to or not. And that also goes back to stinky, not just the animals, but the whole process of infrequency. So there's a whole series of kinds of things that cause Egyptians to want to stay closer to the Nile, and where the water is, and where the water is lifted out and the silt is deposited for their crops to grow, kind of stuff. I did zoom back out. I want you to just see it looks almost like a green snake, doesn't it, the Nile River? And one of the sharp memories of my mind is in '73 when Dorothy and I flew from Cairo down to Luxor on a little propeller plane that the door wouldn't stay shut on. It just sort of flapped. It was new experiences for us in a variety of ways. But to look out the door, kept my seatbelt on, by the way, and it just felt, it looked like there was a green ribbon laid on the brown desert. And that it just, where the water was green, and where the water wasn't, it was brown, and it wasn't sort of a gradual transition. We landed and actually went across the river and out into the desert, discovered it was a gradual transition. It was about 18 inches of transition from total foliage to nothing at all. And so that, that sense of, that you even see here, whoops. Okay, I've had my fun, turn that off. Land of Goshen. Now I can take my hotspot off and save my battery, and okay. It's interesting, the Egyptians, partly because of stuff we talked about, were fairly paranoid about foreigners. They understood they had a very nice setup, and they figured everybody else was wanting part of their action, and they didn't want to share it. And so they guarded their frontiers very carefully, and you could have kind of drawn the frontier along where the green was. Just past the green is where the frontier is, because you're going to defend wherever there's green, and once it's into the desert, why, that you go far enough in to create fortresses and ambushes and traps, but you don't need to defend a whole lot of that dirt. And so they, actually there are fairly decent, certainly not at the level we have now, but fairly decent records of frontier outposts, journals of records. And there are records of them noting Canaanites or foreigners coming into the land who were shepherds, and that they were assigned to graze in that area. And so that area became a kind of a buffer that Egyptians tended to let, and this would be more later than the time of Joseph, they tended to let foreigners be there and sort of establish them there. They could sort of keep their security against them, make sure they could spy on them there, and figure that any word of invasion that these people were going to be helping, they could pick up by their spies there through Goshen. So there's a variety of things that suggest this probably is the place that would have been that particular land. And it provided what Jacob's sons needed with pasturage, enough water to keep grass growing, so that they didn't have to wander as they had in as semi-nomads in Canaan, and it was a kind of a win-win situation. Okay. David?
How did that relate to this being famine time? I mean, if
Mhm.
you're saying that they were able to survive on that land even though they were in the midst of famine?
It is on the border between desert and irrigated sort of area. There's still some water there. Apparently, we have no idea what caused the 7 years of famine and how that disrupted, in some sense, the cycle of the floods and all that kind of thing. And I may be wrong, but my experience, minor experience in farm type stuff, is stuff dies gradually, and so there's more there than there is out in Canaan. In some sense, maybe it's worse than the Egyptians ever anticipated it being in Goshen, but that makes still better than what they had experienced over in Canaan. So they scramble and they are surviving some. One of the fascinating things about, and you know this from being in Israel and Jordan, David, particularly the goats, they can survive on a fascinatingly little amount of grass. Another memory of the 2000 trip that Dr. Colson and I took. I don't think anybody here, Nancy Beveridge was on that trip. From Jerusalem down to Jericho, it looked like somebody just sort of scratched paths on the bare mountains, just like, kind of like, you remember those old music staff things that had 5 pieces of chalk?
Oh, yeah.
It's like they had a whole mountainside of that kind of thing. It just went shh. There's just these lines. Oh, and we got close enough. Well, the guide said, that's where the sheep and the goats just walk. They just walk that path, and they eat whatever comes up along the way. And I couldn't see a bit of green, but they were surviving on the side of mountains, and they had almost a system by which they made sure nothing green survived. So I suppose may not have been the best of times, but it was better than Canaan, and not as bad, not as good as Egypt would like. Why do you suppose Joseph didn't go bring his father home and send his brothers to do that, and he stays in Egypt?
He has responsibilities in Egypt.
He was the second in command. He could probably been just
Okay.
totally for weeks. Dump all of his responsibilities and walk away.
I've heard that twice now.
I didn't.
It may well have been the case. That may reflect more of our sense of Puritan work ethic and responsibility, as opposed to second most powerful man on earth might just say, yeah, I can do this if I want to. It may have been that it maintained his status to not associate with, because the term that was used very early with reference to him was Hebrew, and remember we talked about Habiru as almost an ethnic slur that was used in the ancient world against these kinds of people, which I suspect has something to do with Joseph saying, tell them you're shepherds. Don't use the word Hebrew. Probably is a part of what that's about. Okay. It's also interesting to me, the name Jacob does not appear in this paragraph, only the name Israel. Significance to that? Okay. Kind of connects to the Judah part. Well, verse 29, Joseph made ready his chariot, went up to meet his father Israel in Goshen, presented himself to him, fell on his neck, wept on his neck for a good while. What do you think Joseph's emotions are doing at this point?
It's like a volcano. It's like a volcano having stuffed all that for so long and then being legitimately empowered to let it loose. It's out of control.
Okay.
That is the way it happened to me.
Okay?
The last time his emotions were this way, he was in the presence of other Egyptians, or they heard it.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, he was basically off by himself.
Okay? A private moment with his father, whom he assumed he'd never ever see again. Larry?
Trauma hides emotions very deeply. The loss of his family, the loss of his father, but it's the loss of an eye, the loss of a family that no one else understands but you. And when these issues come up, you're the one holding that, and it's almost as if it's a time of release of something that has been hurting for a long time.
Okay. And it's relatively rare in Scripture that we're given insight into that kind of deep emotional, I'll use the word release for lack of a better term at this point. So we're sort of given a little window into Joseph at this moment that we rarely get. Okay. Well, what do you make of Jacob's statement he can die now that he's seen Joseph?
He's been threatening this for a while, right?
Some of us do that, yeah.
It's like, oh, if Benjamin doesn't come back, I'll die. And every time he's been a central character since Joseph's been gone, every little thing's going to make him die.
Okay.
Oh, so he's like a drama king instead of a drama queen.
Or it could show the depth of his grief in losing Joseph.
Okay, Mark?
His bucket list is complete, and he can see how the covenant can be fulfilled.
Okay. Okay.
What does it say about man's arrogance to think they're in charge of when they live or die?
Yeah. We tend to be there. John?
I'm backing up a little bit, but I'm fascinated about neck showing up twice. And I'm trying to envision if I were to weep on somebody, I'd probably be more on their shoulder than I would be their neck. And the fact that it's repeated here twice, I think other occasions in the Bible when you're on somebody's neck, you've got control over it.
In some instances, there's a dual piece there. This kind of phrase, to fall on one's neck in an emotional embrace, is a fairly characteristic thing you'll see probably half a dozen times in the Old Testament.
Southern people say it.
Okay? I'll take your word for it. Hug your neck? Okay, yeah. Yep. These are also people, John, who greet each other with a kiss. So, cheek to cheek. Okay. I suspect, though, that though Nick has been noticing Jacob talking about dying for a long time, it is an expression of awareness of our own mortality. I'm guessing he didn't say things like this. I was going to say before he was married, but that isn't what created mortality for him. When he was young, when he was a teenager, he didn't think about those things. There comes a point in many people's lives you become aware that, you know, I'm not going to live forever. And we'll discover shortly he's 130 years old. Probably has a few aches and pains and things that make you wonder, is there any need to keep living? And maybe the last item on his bucket list, the most deepest desire he'd ever had was to see Joseph again. And that's accomplished. Like, what else could there be that would be worth aches and pains and the trouble and travail of this life? Okay.
I also just to throw out in that, I just wonder if it's even a cultural expression that's actually, we read it as this sort of negative, maybe kind of thing, and it may actually be a positive. I mean, in Russia, you know, they'd see you and they'd say, boy, you don't look half bad today. You know? I mean, you know, those kind of things, or, you know, everything was always a negative expression that was really a positive. So when he says, now I can die, but it's actually, that's a great statement of joy that I've seen my son Joseph. And that we, you know, and I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just wondering if it actually is just simply a cultural expression of somebody that sometimes we don't understand, that they might say things in such different ways than we do.
I think so, yeah. I think we've covered, maybe we've covered the whole shepherd's piece. So, somebody read verses 1 to 6 of chapter 47 for us then.
So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds, and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen. From among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our ancestors were. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to reside as aliens in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now we ask you, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen, and if you know that there are capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock.
Okay. Why do you suppose Joseph goes and tells Pharaoh that my father and brothers are here, and they've got flocks?
Protocol.
Yeah.
Protection. Introduction.
Yeah. Honesty.
Protocol.
Sounds like a kindergarten teacher
The
there.
wagons are back.
Yeah, the wagons are.
There you go,
You
Mark.
haven't lost your investment here. Yeah. Basically, we've talked a little bit about the sort of suspicion of outsiders and foreigners. And if word were to come to Pharaoh, oh, there's a bunch of Canaanites that are up in the Goshen area, the word would likely come through one of through the military system. And so Joseph has forestalled, or by protocol, just making sure that the top man knows what's happening and why these people are here, and there are, as we like to say, no surprises in this kind of relationship. And so you see a sense of Joseph, a combination of his own just inherent wisdom, and he's learned how he's supposed to operate in reference to Pharaoh and in that kind of context. What's the point of his taking 5 brothers to present to Pharaoh?
He needs to know what he's dealing with.
Pardon?
He needs to know what he's dealing with.
Okay.
And that's a sample.
Okay.
He didn't want to overwhelm Pharaoh.
Okay.
And maybe some of them are more scruffy than others.
At least one of the commentaries I read made a suggestion that he was trying to pick out the 5 least likely to say something stupid. Yeah. Which I understand that process when I try to nominate faculty representatives to this or that kind of committee or whatever. Who will not say something embarrassing or stupid or get us in trouble? And there was a time in my life I was one of the people left off of that list for those reasons. Galen and then Larry.
Is this a good assumption that Judah was not one of those 5 brothers because Judah wasn't named, and you would think that he would have been named, and if he was left out, is there meaning to that?
I don't necessarily assume that. I'm assuming that the point of the 5 is to say this is a representative group.
Right.
To say to Pharaoh, I brought 5 of this group, as opposed to I brought the whole group, in which case Pharaoh would say, only 12? What am I worried about? But this is a beginning of a sense of representation. So I have no idea. I would guess that Judah probably is amongst them, But he may not have been, because Joseph's memories may still be bruised. Who knows? Larry?
He wouldn't have invited me to go with him because I have a strong point that's a fault. Don't ask me if you don't want to know what I think.
Well, Joseph might have had a hard time getting 5 out of this crowd, huh? Yeah.
Is part of the reason for the 5 for the people of Israel to look back later and say, we were all there? Because there's so much of that in their history anyway. All of us were there. We are all included in this covenant. We, all of us, the corporate personality of the people of Israel would resonate with the fact that it was not just Judah who went, but there were 5 who went along with Joseph. And the representation of that.
I think that's the case. The concept of representation. Now, up to this point in Genesis, there's been one son, Isaac, one son, Jacob. Any representatives is the total. But now that you got 12, the concept of representation begins to move in. And that will be an increasing sort of kind of concept. It particularly, I think, influences the way they understand priesthood, is that a smaller group represents a larger group.
Which for us then over in the New Testament, the life of Christ, the representation there begins to take on a different kind of significance for us if we understand the value of representation in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. In a sense, he becomes a representative supreme. One of my memories from Willard Taylor was he
You can just erase that.
I'll do it on this side. Messing up Tony's pictures here. I'm not sure what he called it. There've been several things. At any rate, he drew this big X on the board. And he said, the people of God were Israel. But in the book of Isaiah, you're down to a remnant. And then in a certain sense, there's a focusing of the people of God into one. And I'm sure he talked about Hosea 11:1, out of Israel I called my son. And so all Israel is the son, and the remnant's the son, but Jesus is the son in a certain sense par excellence. And then he said there's the 12 disciples and the church. That whichever side of the funnel or you work it out, there's a focusing in on Jesus, but it doesn't stop there. It widens back out to still be corporate. And that would have been likely 40 years ago he did that diagram, and you can tell it has influence in my thinking and mine still to this day. Yeah, that sense of representation, focus, and participation. Mark, you were on deck.
Yeah, with 5 brothers and Joseph making 6, is there any significance to the number 6?
I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I'd like to say, yeah, it's one less than perfect. I'd like to say, yeah, it's half of them, but I don't know. Nothing's made of it in this case. They request, let your servant, this is the end of verse 4, let your servant settle in the land of Goshen. What does that request do? I've put here for the sake of history. Sure if that makes sense or helps you get into the train of thought I'm trying to think here.
Well, I think it also creates a space for them to not be roaming around as nomads as much, and then it gave them a place to grow. We talked about the nursery earlier, but that as they grew, they became this nation that eventually Egypt defeated.
Okay.
So.
And what happens at this point is not, we are taking this, would you allow us? So they are establishing, and this text establishes from the Israelite, Judahite perspective historically, is that their presence in Egypt was not an invasion, but that they were there by permission, and that it legitimates. It's part of protocol, again, that we're here in the right kind of way. They've described that we've come to reside as aliens in the land. Those are code words that to say, we know that you will perceive us as threat. And so we're here because of the severity of the famine in our own land. We're not here to take over your turf or your space or your wealth, but we're asking your permission to survive here for a little while.
Roger, you mentioned the word protocol, and I see a lot of deference on Joseph's part to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
He's very careful.
It struck me reading these verses yesterday of how much this is like the kind of back and forth and in honor deferring to you, no, in honor deferring to you kind of stuff, gift giving that happens in the Middle East, all those sorts of things that are the maintaining and the establishing of the honor-shame society and the prestige of everybody, so that so nobody's feelings are ruffled, nobody is suspicious, everything is taken care of in terms of relationships, which we don't always pick up on that because we don't manage relationships the same way in our culture. Jess?
I'm fascinated with the extent to which Goshen is referred to over and over again. It is the best according to Pharaoh. To what extent may this also be a part of the land as gift idea that develops further in the land, the promised land?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wondered, this is the best, this is the best, this is the best. Is that really true, or is that part of the what you say in this kind of context? Is it any better than 50 miles further south where Pharaoh's going to stay? I doubt it, or he'd be up there. I think it's some way of saying God has totally provided for them. And you can't say, even when you're trying to just establish protocol and relationship and gift, you can't say this is the best if it's a piece of junk. So it's got to be pretty decent.
There's an extent to which you just keep coming back as if this is gift for you.
Yeah.
It's not permanent, but it's a gift. It's another part of the fulfillment of the fact that the people have a way to continue to be the people of God.
Yeah.
And this gift. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the further north you would get in the delta, the more likely you are to have floods too. And there's risk in that.
Yeah.
And that may be the reason they end up across all of Egypt.
It also can't be the worst of land ever, because Pharaoh's going to settle his livestock with them.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, if I'm Pharaoh, I'm going to put my livestock in the best place as well, so it can't be that bad.
It strikes me that his instructions to Joseph take, if any of them are any good, let them become head of my livestock too. Which is sort of a backhanded compliment, but a very strong compliment too. Tom?
When they refer to themselves as aliens in the land, are they assuring Pharaoh that they're planning to just stay there temporarily and they've still got Canaan as the promised inheritance that they plan to go back to?
Yeah, probably in a certain sense. It's a fairly subtle line to pick up on that. But it is a way of saying we are not coming to be citizens here. We're coming to be visitors.
Well, then that's true, because I've been thinking the same thing Tom is saying. Then they aren't thinking that this is a nursery. They are thinking We're temporary here, we're headed back home eventually. So this is God's plan more than it's man's plan.
Yep. Mark?
It's also very shrewd of Pharaoh to do this because this creates a sense of responsibility to him by this new people that have come into his land. And so if they are the stewards of his, even a portion of his livestock, then now they have a responsibility to report to him.
There's accountability, yeah. My guess is he didn't get to be Pharaoh for being stupid.
Right.
Okay? Well, Vermont?
What I see here is surprised me that they are talking to the topmost guy in the world at that time, and they're not requesting, but they are, in one way they are saying like, we have come to reside as aliens, and then in the following words it says like, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen. So it's just like hard for me to digest like how they can just ask or instead of request. Is it that they were so confident on Joseph that Joseph would have already explained to Pharaoh?
Well,
That's an interesting question. Joseph appears to have coached them in what they're supposed to say. So,
If you don't ask, you won't get it.
yeah. Somebody read 7 through 11. And we'll just make one comment or two on this and we're done.
Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the years of your life? Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my earthly sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life. They do not compare with the years of the life of my ancestors during their long sojourn. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had instructed. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents.
Thank you. First in passing, just interesting, few and hard have been the years of my life. Interesting sort of comment. Twice it says that Jacob blessed Pharaoh.
Yeah.
What does that, what's the significance of that?
Well, isn't that a power kind of play in that you don't usually have an underling blessing someone with more power. You have someone with power blessing someone who is below.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that this nomad perceives himself as quite powerful.
Yeah. Now, where does his power come from?
God.
His relationship to God.
Age.
There you go. All the young people say age, and all the old people say relationship to God. Okay, now we've got the two bases, the two answers covered here. Culturally, the age gives him a sense of authority. That he would think to do that could be dear old Jacob the conniver still. I'll get one in. But you want to call it the end result of a lifetime that's been trying to find the relationship with God that God wanted for him. And there was lots of struggle, and we worked on that early in through the Jacob narrative a lot. And he seemed to finally get to where he was supposed to be with God, and now you sort of see the fruit of that. That he doesn't think it a strange thing to bless Pharaoh. But it is a fascinating turning upside down of the power dynamics of the ancient world. And I think not just power dynamics, but it's an expression of Genesis that God trumps even Pharaoh's. And so it's it's dropped in there, but it's repeated so that you don't miss it. Okay?
You kind of have to understand what a blessing means before you really decide what did you really do in the blessing.
We'll save that for another day. Okay? And we'll save for another day the word Ramesses and what that may or may not mean. Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. It's going to be fair, according to the number of dependents, but it's going to be provision so that the promise will not fail. The descendants will not die. Father, we're thankful for your word and your people and your spirit and the gifts that come to us when those three come together. We pray that the unfolding of our lives might make us into someday patriarchs and matriarchs for whom blessing another is the natural outflow of your blessing in our lives. We ask your watch care as we live in the unfolding reality of the promise still to be the church, to be your people. We ask in Christ's name and for his sake. Amen. Have a good week.